The day I accidentally saved a stranger's life was the same day mine fell apart. I was running late, again, sprinting through the hour entrance at Mercy General, with one sneaker half unted and a protein bar I hadn't had time to eat, still crumpled in my jacket pocket. Night shift had bled into morning shift because Danny called out sick, and I'd been on my feet for 11 hours straight. My hair was a disaster. My scrubs had a coffee stain the shape of Florida on the left thigh, and I had exactly 4 minutes to clock out before they'd dock my pay. That's when the man in the black SUV collapsed in the ambulance bay. I almost walked past him. I want to be honest about that. I was so tired, so hollowed out, that my brain barely registered the commotion at first. Just the usual chaos of an emergency bay morning, people yelling, wheels on asphalt, radio static. But then I heard the specific sound that no nurse ever unhears. A body going limp, the way it hits the ground differently than a person who chooses to sit down. Heavier. Wrong. I spun around before I even made the decision to. He was already down, half in and half out of the open SUV door, and the two men with him, both big, both wearing identical blank expressions, were frozen. Not frozen like they were scared, frozen like they were waiting for someone to tell them what to do. Nobody was doing CPR, nobody had called it out. One of them was reaching for a phone, and the other was just standing there, looking at his boss, like he'd never seen a human body malfunction before. I dropped to my knees on the concrete. Later, people would ask me if I was scared, if I knew who he was, if I hesitated. I didn't know anything, and I didn't hesitate. Not because I'm particularly brave, but because 11 years of nursing school and emergency rotations had turned certain responses into pure muscle memory. You see someone not breathing, you breathe for them. You feel no pulse, you make one. That's the whole job, stripped down. His name, I would find out much later, was Vincent Ashford. But on that morning, in that ambulance bay, he was just a man with no heartbeat and good bone structure, and I had maybe 4 minutes before the damage became permanent. I cracked 2 of his ribs doing compressions. That's not unusual. It happens, especially with a broad chest and the force you actually need to apply when you mean it. I know because I heard them go, that awful cartilaginous pop, and I kept going anyway because a cracked rib heals and a dead man doesn't. He came back with a gasping inhale about 90 seconds in. Right as the crash team came running out with the cart, I stepped back, let them take over, stood up and realized my knees were bleeding through my scrubs from the concrete, and that I was shaking in a very specific delayed adrenaline way that I'd learned to recognize and just ride out. One of the 2 men, the taller one, with a jaw like a brick, was watching me. "You're the one who did that," he said. It wasn't a question. I'm a nurse. I didn't know what else to say. "He's going to need a full cardiac workup. Does he have a primary physician?" The man looked at me for a long moment. "Someone will be in touch." That was it. They followed the crash team inside, and I stood in the ambulance bay alone, and then I went and clocked out 45 minutes late, and they docked my pay anyway. I live in a studio apartment in Greenpoint that costs me $1,850 a month, which is, if you're doing the math, slightly more than what I net after taxes on a staff nurse salary at a mid-tier hospital in Brooklyn. I make it work with a second shift on weekends at an urgent care clinic on Bedford Avenue, and by eating a lot of eggs, and by not having any hobbies that cost money. My mom calls it resourceful. My friend Danny calls it slow suffocation. The truth is probably somewhere in between. The apartment is small enough that I can touch both walls of the kitchen if I stretch my arms out, which I know because I measured once, on a bad day when I needed to understand the exact dimensions of my life. 6 feet, 2 inches, wall to wall. I'd been a nurse for 3 years. I had $4,200 in savings and $61,000 in student debt, and a 5-year plan that was starting to look more like a wishful watercolor than an actual plan. I was 28 years old and I was fine. Not happy, exactly, but fine, which sometimes feels like the best available option when you're too tired to reach for anything better. The call came 4 days after the ambulance bay. I was on my couch eating cereal for dinner, watching something mindless, when my personal cell rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer. I answer numbers I don't recognize about 30% of the time, which my mother considers reckless and my friend Danny considers reasonable, and I've landed somewhere in Danny's camp. "Is this Margot?" A woman's voice, crisp and professionally warm. "Who's asking?" "My name is Catherine. I work for Vincent Ashford. He'd like to thank you personally if you're available. I set down my bowl of cereal. I'm sorry. Who? A beat of silence, like she wasn't used to that response. Vincent Ashford. The name still meant nothing to me. I worked nights in an ER. I didn't read the financial news. I knew approximately nothing about Manhattan's real estate and investment world, which is where I would later learn Vincent Ashford had built what several publications apparently called an empire. You don't have to, Catherine said. Reading my silence correctly, he simply wanted to express his gratitude. He's still recovering at New York Presbyterian. He thought, if you were willing, perhaps lunch, once he's discharged. I thought about it for maybe 4 seconds, lunch. A patient wanting to thank a nurse. That happens sometimes, sure, I said. That's fine. The restaurant was not fine. Not in the sense I was prepared for. I'd worn my nicest blazer, the charcoal one I bought on sale at Madwell 3 years ago, and reserved for job interviews and funerals. I took the subway. I showed up at the address Catherine had texted me and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, just staring at the facade, because the restaurant had no signage, just a discreet brushed steel door, and a man in a dark suit standing beside it, who opened it when he saw me coming, which meant someone had described me in advance, which was a little strange, but I filed it away. Inside was quiet in the way only very expensive places are quiet. Not empty, just engineered for intimacy. The kind of restaurant where the tables are spaced far enough apart that you could have a complete breakdown, and the couple 12 feet away would never know. Vincent Ashford stood when I walked in. He was taller than I'd registered in the ambulance bay, but then, I'd been kneeling over him, so my perspective had been skewed. Dark hair, a few threads of silver at the temples. A gray suit that fit him the way expensive suits fit people who have them made rather than bought. He had the particular physical presence of someone who had never had to make himself smaller in a room, and he had no eyebrow scar. I noticed that specifically, because I'd been expecting one, because that's apparently just a thing people in a certain tax bracket have in these stories. But no, just a face that had lived in it a while, with a jaw that had some history and eyes that were doing something careful and measuring when they landed on me. Margot, he said. Not a question. Not quite a greeting. My name in his mouth like he'd already decided something about it. Mr. Ashford, I said. You look significantly better than the last time I saw you. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile. More like the possibility of one, held in reserve. Please sit. I sat. He sat. A server appeared immediately and poured water from a bottle that I recognized as the kind that costs more per liter than I spend on lunch for a week. I didn't say that out loud. I wanted to thank you, he said. You didn't have to. I know. He looked at me steadily. I wanted to. There was a quality to the way he spoke. Not slowly, exactly, but with a deliberateness that made you feel like every word had been selected rather than simply arrived at. I've met people like that before, occasionally, surgeons, mostly, and once a federal judge who came through the ER after a car accident. People who'd spent decades in rooms where the wrong word had consequences. The staff at the hospital told me you were 11 hours into a double shift, he said. 12, by the time you showed up, and you stopped anyway. That's the job. He was quiet for a moment. My cardiologist tells me that if you hadn't intervened within the first 60 seconds, the outcome would have been different. Probably, I said. But the crash team was 90 seconds behind you. He tilted his head slightly. I know. I watched the security footage. I didn't know what to say to that. I picked up my water glass. How long have you been a nurse? He asked. 3 years. Post-Lincolnshire. 6 if you count school. You like it. It wasn't a question, but I answered it anyway. I like the parts I can control. The parts where the thing you do actually works. I paused. I don't love the paperwork, or the parking situation at the hospital, or the vending machine on the 3rd floor that eats quarters. He looked at me, and then, quietly, unexpectedly, he laughed. Just a breath really, but real, like something that escaped before he could stop it. The vending machine, he repeated. F3. Animal crackers. It's personal. I'll look into it. You don't have to. I stopped. He was still looking at me with that expression I couldn't categorize. Were you serious? I own the building. I stared at him. You own Mercy General's building? The property, not the hospital. A pause. There's a distinction. I thought about that for a moment. That explains the parking situation. You should know the surface lot is a complete disaster. People are parking on the grass. I'll have someone look into the lot, and the vending machine, and the vending machine. I didn't know if he was humoring me or if he actually meant it. I'd find out later that Vincent Ashford had never once in his adult life said something he didn't mean. It just wasn't in his operating system. I didn't see him for 2 weeks after that lunch. Not because anything happened. Nothing happened. We ate, we talked, he thanked me again when we left, and his driver materialized a car on the sidewalk, within approximately 8 seconds of us stepping outside, which I clocked and chose not to comment on. He'd asked if I needed a ride and I'd said no, and he'd looked at me for a moment like he was going to argue and then didn't, and that was it. I went home on the subway. I worked my shifts, I ate my eggs. And then a box arrived at the nurse's station addressed to me, which was unusual enough that Danny texted me about it before I even got to work. Inside was a brand new vending machine, not a replacement for the old F3, a supplementary one, installed in the third-floor break room with a handwritten card that said only for the animal crackers. VA. Danny lost her mind. In the good way. Who is VA? She said, cornering me by the locker room. Who is? VA, a patient sent you a vending machine, Margot. He owns the building. That is not a normal thing that happens. She grabbed my arm. Is he attractive? He's a patient. Was. Past tense. He was a patient. Now he's a man who sent you a vending machine. I thought about Vincent Ashford's face when he'd laughed. That small surprised sound, like it had gotten out before he could contain it. He's... Yes, he is. Danny made a sound that I'm fairly certain rattled the lockers. He called the following Thursday, my personal cell which I had not given him, a fact I led with when I picked up. I didn't give you this number. Catherine is very resourceful. A pause. I should have asked. I apologize. I leaned against the counter in my 6'2" kitchen. How's the heart? Functional. My cardiologist is cautiously optimistic. Good. A silence that was, strangely, not uncomfortable. Outside my window, someone was arguing on the street in what sounded like 2 languages simultaneously, and a dog was contributing a third opinion. I'd like to take you to dinner, Vincent said. If you're willing. Like the lunch, not like the lunch. Another pause. I want to be clear about what I'm asking. I stood in my tiny kitchen and thought about that for a moment. About the particular way he'd said my name when I walked into the restaurant. About the vending machine. About the fact that I was 28 years old and had been fine for so long that I'd started to confuse fine with happy. Okay, I said. Dinner. Here's the thing nobody tells you about falling for someone who operates in a completely different world than yours. The world itself is only part of it. The money, the car that materializes, the restaurant with no signage. All of that is background noise. What actually gets you is the specific attention. The way Vincent listened when I talked. Not the polite, waiting for their turn listening that most people do, but actual listening, the kind where they remember the detail you mentioned in passing, and bring it back 3 conversations later, like they'd been holding it carefully in the meantime. He remembered that I hadn't eaten my protein bar the morning of the ambulance bay. He asked, at dinner, if I'd eaten it afterward. I hadn't even mentioned it was there. I'd described the morning in passing, and he'd caught that detail and kept it. That was the thing that undid me. Not the restaurant, not the driver, the protein bar. We were 6 weeks in, not dating, exactly, not dating, existing in some negotiated middle territory that we hadn't named, when I found out what Vincent Ashford actually was. I mean, I knew what he was publicly. I'd Googled him, obviously, after the vending machine. Real estate, investments, the kind of profile that calls a person a power player in the headline and then spends 3 paragraphs on his net worth. I understood that he was wealthy in a way that was somewhat abstract to me, the way that $2.3 billion is abstract. It's just a number that doesn't connect to any lived experience I have reference points for. What I didn't know was the part that doesn't show up in the profiles. I found out the way you find out things you weren't supposed to. Accidentally, and all at once. It was a Tuesday. I'd gone to his apartment. A penthouse on the Upper East Side that I'd only been to twice before, and I had a key because he'd given me 1 2 weeks prior in that quiet, deliberate way he did things. No ceremony, just pressing it into my hand and saying, in case you're ever there before me. His assistant had texted that he'd be an hour late coming from a meeting, so I let myself in, made tea in the kind of kitchen where every appliance is hidden behind panels, and sat down at the dining table with my phone. That's when the door opened. Not the front door. A side door I'd assumed was a closet. The man who stepped through it was not Vincent. He was thick-necked, and wearing an expression that suggested he'd walked in on exactly the wrong person. Behind him came another man, and behind that man came a third, and then Vincent was the fourth one through the door, and his face when he saw me sitting at his dining table with a cup of tea was the most unguarded I'd ever seen it. Surprise, then something that looked like, not shame exactly, but a kind of reckoning. The three men stopped. Vincent said something to them in a low voice that I couldn't hear, and they filed back through the side door, and then it was just the two of us, and the sound of the city 40 floors down, and a cup of tea that was getting cold. I looked at him. "Sit down," I said, "and then tell me the truth." He sat down. He looked at me across the table, and for the first time since I'd known him, he took a breath before he started speaking. "There are parts of what I do," he said carefully, "that are not in any profile," I gathered. "I want you to understand." He stopped, started again. "I have never lied to you about who I am. You've never told me the whole truth either." A pause. "No." I thought about the three men, the side door that wasn't a closet, the particular way the two men in the ambulance bay had frozen. Not scared, waiting for instruction, like people accustomed to a very clear hierarchy. The way Vincent moved through spaces, like someone who had never had to account for his own safety, because he'd outsourced that concern to other people long ago. "Are you dangerous?" I asked. He held my gaze. "To the people who come after the people I care about, yes. That's a very specific answer. It's an honest one." I looked at him for a long moment. I had a decision to make. The kind you can feel the weight of before you've made it, the way the air changes right before a storm. I could leave. I should probably leave. Every practical, reasonable, 11 years of keeping yourself safe in New York instinct I had was drawing up arguments. But I thought about the protein bar, about the vending machine card in his handwriting, about the way he'd laughed, that small, escaped sound, and how I'd realized in the moment it happened that I might be the first person in a long time to get that sound out of him. "Tell me everything," I said. "Not the parts you think I can handle, all of it." He looked at me for a moment like I'd said something that cost him something to hear. Then he nodded, and he told me. It took 2 hours. There were parts that frightened me, and parts I didn't fully understand, and parts that made a specific kind of bleak sense when I lined them up against things I'd half noticed and filed away. The structure of what he'd built, the people who answered to him, the line he maintained, carefully and deliberately, between the world he ran and the people he brought into his personal life, a line that had, apparently, kept his personal life largely empty for the better part of a decade. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked when he finished. "You asked, no. Why are you? Why me? Why does this apply to me?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because I want it to. That's not enough of an answer. I know." He looked at me with that careful, measuring expression that I'd learned by now was what his face did when he was being most honest. "I don't have a better one yet. I'm working on it." I stood up, went to the window. 40 floors down, New York was doing what it always does, moving, indifferent, enormous. I thought about my apartment in Greenpoint, about the 6'2" kitchen, about the 4 minutes in an ambulance bay that had turned out to be some kind of hinge point in a story I hadn't known I was in. "I need some time," I said. "Take whatever you need." "I'm not." I turned around. "I'm not walking out. I'm not ending this. I need time to sit with this and decide what I think." He looked at me with something on his face that it took me a second to identify, because I'd never seen it there before. Relief, I think, and behind it, something rawer. "Okay," he said. "The vending machine was a very good move for the record." He blinked, and then, there it was again, that small surprise laugh, quieter than before, more real. "I took 4 days, I went home. I worked my shifts, I ate my eggs." I talked to Danny about half of it, the half I could put into words without sounding like I was describing a screenplay, and she listened without interrupting, which is something Danny almost never does. "What do you want?" she asked when I finished. "I don't know." "Yes, you do. You just don't want to say it out loud yet, because then it becomes real." I looked at her. "When did you get wise?" "I've always been wise. You've just been too tired to notice." I thought about what I wanted. Not abstractly, not in the realm of theoretical good decisions, but specifically, what did I, Margot, who had spent 3 years being fine, actually want? I wanted Vincent. I wanted the protein bar. I wanted the side of him that almost nobody got, that he was apparently only slowly figuring out how to offer. And I'd already decided before I'd taken the 4 days. I knew that. I think I knew it sitting at his dining table with cold tea, when he said to the people who come after the people I care about, and I understood, with some part of me that doesn't deal in practicalities, that I was one of those people now. What happened over the next several months, I'll tell you honestly, it wasn't simple. His world pushed back, the way things push back when they feel disrupted. There were people who considered me a liability, a variable that hadn't been part of whatever calculation they'd accepted. There were nights I drove home from his apartment with my hands, white-knuckled, on the steering wheel, and my mind running scenarios I didn't like the endings of. There was one night, March, cold, almost 1 a.m, when a man I didn't know appeared at the door of my building, with questions he phrased like conversation and eyes that were doing inventory. I called Vincent before I'd even closed the lobby door behind me, and I want to be clear. I didn't call him scared. I called him angry. Someone just showed up at my building, I said when he picked up. Dark coat, mid-40s, he knew my name. A silence that lasted exactly 2 seconds. Go upstairs. Lock the door. Do not open it for anyone. I know how doors work, Vincent. Margot, I'm already inside. I was in my elevator. Who was he? I'm going to find out. His voice had gone to that place it went sometimes. Not colder, exactly, but cleared of everything that wasn't information and decision. I looked at my reflection in the elevator doors. I'm angry. I know. A pause. That's I know. This is what I signed up for, I said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an accusation. Just naming it. Yes. He never lied to me about that. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry. Just fix it. He fixed it. I don't know all of what that meant, and I've learned, somewhat deliberately, that there are things in Vincent's world where my knowing the details doesn't serve either of us. That's a line I drew, not him. He would have told me everything, every time. He's like that. There's a moment I come back to, when I'm thinking about how we got here. It's not the ambulance bay. It's not the restaurant with no signage. It's not even the vending machine. Though I maintain the vending machine was objectively excellent strategy. It's a Wednesday afternoon in April, 6 months after that ambulance bay morning. We're in his kitchen, the one with the hidden appliances, and I'm making coffee because he makes terrible coffee, which is somehow the single domestic competency this man has failed to acquire, despite having access to every possible resource. I'm still in my scrubs. I'd come straight from a shift. My hair is a disaster, same as always. Vincent is at the kitchen island going through something on his laptop, and he looks up at me while I'm waiting for the coffee to brew. And he says, not like an announcement, not like a moment, just matter-of-factly, "You're the clearest-headed person I've ever known." I look at him. I once cried because a vending machine ate my last dollar, and then you problem-solved it. He tilts his head slightly. That's what I mean. I look at him for a long moment, at this man who runs a parallel world I only partly understand, who sends handwritten notes and laughs when caught off guard, and spent 45 years building walls that he started, very deliberately, dismantling from the inside out the moment a tired nurse in coffee-stained scrubs dropped to her knees in an ambulance bay and gave him back his heartbeat. Vincent. I love you. I said it the way he says things, matter-of-factly, like it had already been true, and we were just getting around to naming it. He looked up from the laptop. His face did the thing it does when he's being most honest, that careful, open expression I'd learned to read. I know, he said. Then, I've been trying to find the right moment to say it first. You missed it. I did. He looked at me with something warm and slightly rueful. I'll do better. You already do. I turned back to the coffee. And you're going to learn to make this eventually. I'm not doing it forever. That sounds like a long-term arrangement. It is. I poured 2 cups. Don't make it weird. He made a sound that I can only describe as quietly, completely happy. I carried the coffee to the island, and he closed the laptop, and outside the window New York was doing what it always does. Enormous, indifferent. Moving. And I had stopped being fine somewhere along the way, and started being something better than that. And I hadn't even noticed the exact moment it happened, which I think is the only way the real things ever start.